Amen. Okay. So today, our guest speakers, we have two speakers from the ELCA Churchwide office. One is Steve Olschlager. He is the coordinator of stewardship programming for the ELCA. And our other guest speaker is Keith Mundy, the programming director for stewardship for the ELCA. So with that, Steve, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you. And thank you for being with us today.
Okay, great. Can you hear me all right, everybody? Okay, good. In addition to working with Keith and Jill at the ELCA, I also work at my congregation. I'm the Director of Engagement and Generosity at a congregation in North Suburban Chicago. And so this conversation is very real to the conversations that we're having at my congregation. And in addition to that, prior to working for the ELCA, I've spent a good number of years as an entrepreneur. And back in 2009, with the financial crisis that we experienced back then, the small business that I was owning and operating with a partner, we went through an experience where the project that we were working on, the foundation pulled the plug on it, and we went from having 8 employees to having to go back to just myself and my wife, and all of the stress and anxiety of figuring that out and realizing you're working with friends and colleagues who are depending on you to make the best possible decisions about their financial realities, and working through all of that. It's all very real to me. So the good news in all of that is, even though that particular time was an incredible time of stress and anxiety, in the end, everything did work out, not just for my wife and myself, but for all of my colleagues. They all ended up finding other opportunities, and things have worked out. And I think that as a person of faith, that's the kind of hope that I like to bring to all things, that in the end, God finds a way to make things work out. And as Richard Rohr says, if they don't seem to be working out, well, it's not the end yet. As Jill was saying, no easy answers. I have a feeling I'm probably not going to tell you anything that you didn't know already, but I still think that this is a valuable exercise. One of the things that happened recently at our congregation, just an awareness of the incredible burden that our pastor was shouldering, trying to figure all this stuff out. And a big decision had to do with, what do we do about worship? Do we go ahead and have worship? There were no directives at that point that we shouldn't have worship, even though our society was moving in the direction of saying no large gatherings. And so what do you do? And one of the things that our pastor did, he got a group of good thinkers together to say, how do we figure this out? And I could just tell from being there at that gathering, how that helped him to sort of say, this isn't the decision that you need to make on your own, but this is a decision that we make together. And by talking through this, we get to a better outcome that's our decision, not just the senior pastor's decision, with all of the weight of trying to make that in the best possible way. So I wanted to, before getting into the financial stuff, I wanted just to say a few things about process. And one of the things is, I think if you haven't done so already, think about who some key individuals are that you can call together. Maybe it's people who are on council, elected officials in the congregation, others, but a panel of folks that can help to sort through all of this stuff. Another thing around the topic of process has to do with embracing the difficult conversations. And there's a line of thinking from an organization that's written a book called Crucial Conversations. And what they say is that any organizational health is highly correlated with your ability to hold difficult conversations. And typically we don't have them because they're difficult, but that's where we need to go. And obviously with something like what we're going through now, there's plenty of material for difficult conversations. So try to find ways to have those even though they're uncomfortable. Going through the different options, especially with people who don't always have the same perspectives and opinions, that's how we get the best possible decisions. Even if we end up in the same place that we started, social science has proved that going through the process of vetting our ideas with other people gets us to a place where ultimately the quality of our decisions is better. Also, along the line of process, if you haven't already identified some sort of a platform like what we're using now, Zoom, get something and start using it. I'm not sure in this day and age, given the call to not get together face to face, how you, I guess, just the standard phone, but something like a Zoom account, it's $15 a month. And if you have a smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android, you can download the app. You can download the app for tablets or desktop. There's all sorts of options, but I think it really is the time to get set up and think about, you know, do you have a camera? Do you have a microphone? How are you going to use this? Because this is quickly becoming the go-to standard for bringing people together, for council meetings, for finance meetings, for all sorts of meetings. So I would strongly encourage that. And last thing I wanted just to say about this idea of process is that we need both critical thinking and we need hope, and we need those two together, right? And critical thinking without hope leads us to cynicism, and we certainly don't need that. But hope without critical thinking is not good either, and that leads us to something like naivete. And so how do we find the sweet spot as people of faith where we bring together both hope and critical thinking to get the best possible outcome? In terms of the financial stuff, here are some things that I thought about. It starts with cash flow and our expectation of what cash flow is going to be. I'm guessing we're on the call because we're more concerned about negative cash flow, that expenses are going to be exceeding income or revenue, and then what do we do about that, right? And so identifying what does that look like, and where are the gaps, and what are the timing issues, and then sort of going through the various components that make up the cash flow to say, you know, on the income side, what is our income looking like, and do we have online giving? And I think Jason and Keith are going to mention some things about opportunities for online giving. Is that correct, Joe? Yeah, okay. And so I'm not going to get into that, but obviously if people can't come to church, you want to have other ways that they can participate in giving and reminding them of those opportunities. One of the things that I think we want to be careful about, and this is something that we've talked at my congregation, is what is the narrative that we're putting out for people? If we're saying we're closed because we're not doing worship, how does that sort of motivate and inspire people to continue to support what the church is doing? As opposed to saying, just because we're not worshiping doesn't mean we're closed. We're doing church differently. We're looking for other opportunities to be church. And at this particular time, because of the constraints, we're not doing worship in the same ways, but that doesn't mean we're closed. The church is not closed, okay? And so one of the things that we've toyed with there even is to say, what does it look like to say there would be certain times during the week where the sanctuary will be open, not for an organized worship experience, but for the sanctuary to be used for personal time of prayer and meditation. And if you come in and use the building during that time, then, you know, maintain your proper social distance, but there'd also be a chance for you, if you have an offering, to drop it off at that time. And we did that this past Sunday. We recorded a worship experience, but we said the sanctuary would be open. We had a number of people who stopped by and brought checks with them to continue to give their offering to our congregation. So promoting the online giving, promoting automated giving. This is a chance where if you can get people to say, all right, here's my plan for my giving. I want to give this much every week, every month. Lift up those opportunities. and remind people about that. Another thing is the whole idea that so much of stewardship really has to do with relational capital of leaders and how we inspire people about the ministry that we're in together and how those ministries make a difference, and especially in times of challenge and adversity. And so thinking about the relational capital that we all have, the people that we know, people who have resources, even in this time of financial constraint, who could step forward in ways if they were invited and challenged and inspired to do so. So part of that then again is continuing to remind people of the difference that the congregation makes and the ways that in these times you're working to find new ways to continue making a difference. So those were the things that I thought of on the income side of things. On the expense side of things, there are the opportunities to trim expenses. Where will the savings be? And so going through your profit and loss statement and looking at the areas, and of course those are going to lead to some uncomfortable sort of thought experiments. Another thing related to expenses is what expenses can be pushed out to some point in the future. I know at our particular congregation, we were looking at doing some different repairs on the building. We've said, okay, well, we don't really need to do that right now. Actually, we had a conversation going about refinancing our mortgage. And even though that was going to save us money, there was a refinancing fee that was pretty significant. And we said, you know what? We don't need to spend that money on a refinancing fee right now. Let's hold on to that cash. We can always refinance somewhere down the road. So what are the possibilities for different kinds of expenses to be pushed out further into the future where you're not going to have to deal with them immediately? In terms of assets, thinking about any sort of reserve funds that you have and how those could be used for these particular contingencies. So if you do have a deficit in your cash flow, what kinds of reserves do you have that could be deployed at this particular time? Even restricted funds that could be, I'm not saying use restricted funds for things that are totally different than what they were restricted for, although congregations do that if they have some sort of plan or method to pay those back. But even to say, well, what were the expectations for these funds when they were made restricted, and might we be able to find ways to use those that still meet those restrictions, but would allow us to handle some of our expenses that we need to handle in the near term. And then in terms of liabilities, the thing that I was thinking about, opportunities for short-term lines of credit, whether that would be through some sort of a banking relationship that you have, or members of your congregation, the goodwill that you've used, the social capital that you've established with people, to be able to have some sort of borrowing mechanism, again, to get through sort of the short-term cash flow issue. So those were the thoughts that I had. And again, I'm guessing that none of these things are things that you haven't thought of, but I think to the extent that you can get a group of people together, your best thinkers, and start looking through this stuff, I think you'll come up with some options, and it won't be something that any one person will have to bear the burden, the weight of all of that by yourself.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to invite our colleague Jenny McClelland to unmute and share any questions that might be coming up in the chat section.
No questions at this time.
Okay, all right, great. So Steve, thank you for sharing. At this point, we're going to turn the floor over to our colleague Keith Mundy.
Before we do that, Jill, we just had one question pop up. Anyone know if Mission Investment Fund or others will be having different short-term loan options? What are our resources within the church?
I don't know. I don't know that we have anyone from Mission Investment Fund on the call today, but they do have significant resources, and they are looking at making some new options available. At least they had planned to this spring. I'm not sure exactly what that schedule is. We would have to check with them on that.
Thank you.
Right, and that's both Mission Investment Fund, but also the credit union as well. ELCA Credit Union also is making, so for example, Credit Union was looking to offer home mortgages starting this spring. They've made car loans available starting last fall, I believe. So we've got a number of places of different ways that those two institutions are trying to make themselves available to their members. All right. So Jill, you'd like me to say a few words about online giving, perhaps?
That would be fantastic. And as we weave into that, I just want to read out loud something that Mary Morrow just put in the chat area, that she just learned that through TechSoup, you can register for a Zoom account and it's 50% off for nonprofits. That's a tremendous gift at this time. Zoom has been one of our most stable platforms that we've been able to use, especially during this time. So just wanted to draw everyone's attention to that. So Keith, yeah, the floor is yours for the next.
Well, thank you. I'll take a few minutes to talk about that. Some of you know that online giving in various formats has been available for a number of years to congregations. And we currently have two preferred vendors. These are companies out of a long list that we identified as being what we might call strategic partners as we look towards the near and the long-term future, because we think they offer safe, secure, good services, good customer service to congregations. And that's Tithely, Tithe.ly out of California, and Vanco out of Minneapolis. And Vanco being the company that formerly managed Simply Giving, which was simply the name for a process that's owned by Thrivent. And so those are the two different organizations we've worked with. Let me just say a few broad things about the concept of online giving and giving in total. So some of you might be familiar that in the big picture, each year ELCA congregations receive somewhere between 2.5 and 2.7 billion with a B dollars in their offering plates or through other kinds of gifts to congregations. 2.5 to 2.7 billion. About 1.7 billion of those dollars are what we would call regular offering. They're offerings that come in to support the regular ongoing ministry of the congregation. And what we've been trying to track is, so how has online giving been growing as we look over time? And we would see, if we were to go back 5 years ago, we would see that there were many fewer companies that were in that business offering that service. And that number has grown to well over 50 companies right now that offer a service of processing gifts online. Again, Tithely and Vanco are the two that we work with. In the case of the ELCA, based on information that we have both from Tithely and Vanco, we have about 9,300 congregations, and we have somewhere around 1,200 to 1,300 of those congregations who work with either Tithely or Vanco. We would expect there are probably another 1,000 or so congregations that work with other service providers, so that puts us somewhere in the range of 2,500 congregations that are using online giving from some service provider, but that's still less than a third of our total congregations. So just kind of keep that in mind. Approximately, or an estimated 2/3 of our congregations have not been actively using that. The other piece for us to keep in mind is how many households in a congregation typically are using online giving. And so there's a number there that we, at least through some calculations, is estimated that the average in a congregation is about 20 households, okay? So now if we take a look at that number and we'd say 20 households times 2,500 congregations, so that's about 50,000. And so we have a lot of households, because there are in the ELCA approximately 1.4 million, 1.3 million households, okay, of which 50,000 do online giving. So it suggests there's a strong area for growth here. Okay, a strong area for growth. And that's part of what we are trying to encourage congregations, and particularly with recent developments, to begin making sure this is available to people in their congregations. And it doesn't not seem to make a difference whether we're talking about younger or older households. Both of them participate in online giving. We have seen congregations who have typically not offered it. And when they started to offer it, they found that the giving from younger households tended to increase because they were not giving in cash or check. And this gave them a way to grow their giving. And that had a significant impact on some congregations. But overall, it is something that for all age groups is starting to grow and get traction. Let me stop right there and see if there are any questions that anyone might have about what I've shared so far.
Thank you, Keith. This is Jenny McClellan. We have a question about administrative costs. Could you speak to that for both Tithely and Vanco?
Okay, so yes, let's talk about that. So there historically have been a couple different kinds of fees. One is a monthly fee, one has been a transaction fee, and one has been a percentage of contribution fee. Okay, in the case of Vanco and Tithely, both of them, effective with their agreements, waived the monthly fees. So there is no monthly fee to participate with either of those services. And then each of them, there's two different ways the other fees apply. If there's an online gift is typically, there is a percentage that is charged, and that percentage is very similar for each of them, about 2.25, 2.3% per of the transactions value, and that's pretty common. It's higher with American Express, but generally Visa or MasterCard is going to be in that range. Now, what to keep in mind as a congregation is to note that we suggest, and this is a common practice, that the donor be given the opportunity to pay that fee. To say, when you make a contribution of $100, you pay the fee of 2.2%, additional $2.20. Now, and what should be noted there is the majority of the time, the donor does pay that fee. So if we go through and look at the total number of transactions, and we look at what percentage of those transactions that the donor pays the fee, it is the majority. In fact, in some cases, it approaches 60 to 70% of the time the donor pays that fee. So the actual cost to the congregation, if the donor pays 50% of the time, the actual cost of the congregation is really only 1.15 or 1.1% of what the total value is of those contributions. And so that's that portion of the fee. Now, if you are a congregation that has what are called ACH, or these are the paper transactions where people sign up and the congregation becomes involved with the administration, there's a different fee structure for that, which is so much per transaction, and that number is a fairly small number. Now, to recognize also that Vanco has also what is called grandfathered pricing, which means some of our congregations have been Vanco customers for a long time, as in 20 years. And some of that, the pricing that congregation has had has been grandfathered over that 20 years. And so that pricing may be better than what the current market price is, or list price. And so it is something to take a look at, to say, I want to know what my true cost is. I probably should call and talk to Vanco and see what my cost is right now. Those of you who use Vanco, and by the way, we have about almost 4,000 of our ELC congregations use Vanco. One of the reports you have access to on the Vanco report menu there is something called a product volume report. And in that product volume report, you can go in and find out what are the dollar values of the transactions for each of the different kinds of ways of giving. So whether that's ACH, or whether that's mobile, or whether that's on a web page, whatever it is, it will go through and tell you how much volume you have in your congregation. That will give you an idea of how much do we have, how much electronic giving do we have right now, and whether that's text or whether that's on your website whether that's from a laptop, whether that's from a mobile phone, breaks that all down for you to give you an idea of what that where that comes from. That same kind of information is available from Tithely, but I'm still working with them on the format of that report to be able to say what's the format of that report and how easy is it for our ELCA users to get access to that, to be able to monitor how is their online giving doing. And that's something I'm working with Tithely on right now, because we're trying to take a look at what the trends and what the patterns are. Just as an example, I can tell you, as we've kind of looked at some numbers recently, that if we take a look at what Vanco currently calls their Give Plus product, which is their mobile app, their online, their text, their swipe card, their kiosk, all that kind of giving. In our ELCA congregations, the numbers through December of 2019, just a few months ago, were 70% higher in 2019 than they were in 2018. 70% higher. That suggests there are congregations that are shifting and are doing more online giving. So that we see that as a growing area. We expect that trend to increase. Generally speaking, though, ELCA congregations tend to give a lower percentage of their giving online than some other denominations. And we're trying to increase that number.
Keith, I'm going to
see if there's some questions.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions, and we also are fairly late into our time together. I know that some people have put questions in the chat area, and I am going to capture these questions and hopefully have either you or Steve O respond to them and send them out via email. I'd like to give an opportunity for our participants to break out into their rooms and have a chance to talk in a smaller group. Those of you that put questions in the chat area and have not been able to hear answers to them, I encourage you to bring them up and see if there's a wisdom of the whole as you gather together. Facilitators, you know what you are asked to do to facilitate the conversation.